Hello, everybody, and welcome to another show of the Living Algorithm. So, good morning, Sushant. How are you doing
Good
today?
morning. Very well.
Folks, today we are diving into one of the oldest and still most puzzling observations in cancer biology. Why do cancer cells ferment? So, just for the sake of context, 100 years ago, Otto Warburg noticed something strange. Most normal cells, when they have plenty of oxygen, break down glucose completely through mitochondria. Efficient oxidative phosphorylation that yields a lot of ATP. Cancer cells, however, take up huge amount of glucose and convert much of it into lactate, even when oxygen is available, right? And its aerobic glycolysis was known as the Warburg effect, right? Now, Sushant, let's begin the discussion. And my first question to you is, why do these cancer cells actually ferment?
Okay. Let us understand this. I think we discussed this during the last episode also that, uh, around 2 billion years ago, there were single cell organisms. Unlike us,
Hmm.
we are multicellular organisms, right? So essentially, single cell organism does not have that capacity to actually, use oxygen to transform the fuel into ATP, right? And they used to ferment. So that was fermentation means they used to generate an enormous amount of energy without oxygen, which was an oxygen independent pathway, right? And when that energy source used to dissipate, they used to die, right? So essentially, that was the thing which was happening in a single cell organism. And then, there's a larger cell which consume a smaller cell, and instead of, using it for its own fuel, they formed an alliance that, let us work together. And, they decided that, the smaller organism is what will use oxygen to transform glucose and fatty acids into ATP, right? And
Hmm.
that some smaller organism was mitochondria, right? So essentially, in the presence of oxygen, we breathe in, we eat food, and the electrons from the foods are taken off from NAD to NAD, it is connected to NADH that carries electrons to different electron transport chain, different complexes in the electron transport chain. That is a jump out of oxygen, the complex side that is used to produce ATP, right? Sorry, transform ATP, right? That is a normal aerobic metabolism of ATP production that fuels every single biochemical process, whether it is enzymatic functions, molecule production, metabolite production. A lot of these are, an outcome of we need ATP to produce energy. For instance, even let's take an example of insulin, right? So insulin is secreted by pancreatic beta cells, and it needs enormous amount of ATP to do that. Without the mitochondria of pancreatic beta cells functional producing ATP efficiently using oxygen, you cannot have insulin. So that is a normal way. Now, in
Hmm.
case of cancer cells, because there's a corrupted mitochondria, and the because of this corrupted mitochondria, since mitochondria controls the apoptotic signaling and controls the calcium signaling in calcium circuits and channel regulation, right? Because of this mitochondria, there's disruption the number structure and function of the mitochondria. So basically, there's an breakdown in the cellular communication network, and cells detached from the collective, and the mitochondria dysfunction biochemically. What happens is that even in the presence of oxygen, they cannot produce transform ATP, right? And they they actually resort to the ancient fermentation pathways. So when there is no oxygen, right, we
Hmm.
still normally also in the aerobic metabolism also around 10% of the energy is produced via fermentation pathways. So basically, let's take an example of heart attack, right? So when you have a heart attack, there's a disrupted flow of oxygen, different flow of blood flow, right? So essentially, your cells resort to a short burst of lactate is there. So if you look at the heart patients in the bloodstream, there's a lot
Hmm.
of lactate being produced, right? Because that's a normal way of producing energy in the absence of oxygen. But again, that is for a shorter time when you reinstate the heart pumping, by different operative measures. So the oxidative the measure of producing producing energy using oxygen comes back, right? So that is the reason, your neurons cannot actually handle a lot of lactate. So if you do not reinstate your heart function, probably you die, right? So
Mm,
again, unlike that, cancer cells start fermenting, right? And they, in the absence of the oxygen, they start fermenting, and they ferment glucose and glutamine, which are the two essential fuels which they ferment, and when they ferment glucose, they produce lactic acid. When they ferment glutamine, they produce succinic acid, and these two
mm,
are the metabolic waste products. And to mention that, this is a way of cancer cells surviving. That is a
mm,
survival mechanism of the cancer cells, because they have lost the machinery to burn, glucose and carry acid in the presence of oxygen to produce ATP, right? So again, that is a survival way to survive within the host environment, right? Um, so again, it is important to understand here that there's a huge difference in the efficiency of uh, you know oxygen dependent and oxygen independent pathways. So when we talk of
okay.
oxidative phosphorylation, it produces a lot amount of ATP, around 36 units of ATP, right? Versus the fermentation, where it is an oxygen independent pathway which produces somewhere around 2 to 3 ATP or 4 ATP sort of, right? So it's so essentially, this is this is what fermentation is, and that is how they use these nutrients to, then they will use the nutrients to grow, to proliferate, to 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 make more blood vessels, what we call angiogenesis, right? For their own growth, right? And again, and when they ferment these, they produce waste products. These waste products protect them from the toxins which are meant to kill them, the toxic therapies which we generally resort to, like chemotherapy, immunotherapy, other therapies, right? So these metabolic waste products are the shield to protect the cancer cells from those toxic therapies. So these that is the reason why these therapies will does not work.
Now, since you mentioned lactate, I have a question around it. Lactate itself is no longer just as a waste product, right? Now, what role exactly is it playing in the tumor microenvironment? As a fuel for other cells, as signaling, as immune suppression, or is it promoting the metastasis?
No, no. Metastatic cancer has nothing to do with lactate. So it is
Okay.
an different concept altogether. So
Mm-hmm.
so as I mentioned, these are metabolic waste products that acts as a shield, right, to to prevent the cancer cells from getting attacked by the chemotherapies, right? The drugs which we take to with the hope to kill tumors, right? So these are this shields cancer cells from these attack, right? So
Okay.
so so lactic, again, we all, as I explained about the heart disease, also heart attack, lactic acid is produced. Even in exercise, when you're doing too much of an exercise, when there's not that much oxygen being pumped, and also your body gets into a lactate method. So another example I would tell you is, in terms of lactate, it's just deviating a bit, right? So essentially, uh, when we eat food, right, the digestion of food needs enormous amount of ATP, right? Around 25% of cardiac output, the oxygen, right, which is required to produce ATP for digestion process, right, is actually needs a lot of this cardiac output to digest food. And then, if you are immediately after, we are generally told that, after consuming food, have a walk, or do some exercise, or do some brisk walk and all that. So essentially it is wrong, right? So essentially you should wait for at least 10 to 15 minutes or 20 minutes before you get into a walk mode, because again, when you're doing a walk, you are using oxygen towards fueling your muscles and all those things. And again, your gut cells and your intestinal cells could actually, you do not have that kind of oxygen to actually digestion, then they start resorting to fermentation process, lactate, to use that ATP to digest food and digest to the digestion process, and then again this lactate further causes stomach cramps and all those things. So these are general. So this is another way of so that is because we consume a lot of glucose, right? That is again another important point to mention, that our mitochondria are uses fatty acid more efficiently than glucose. So when you are consuming fatty acids, they can consume less oxygen to produce the same amount of ATP from the fatty acids, or can produce more ATP from the same sort of oxygen, right? So essentially,
mm,
it produces less free radicals. So again, that is more an
mm,
efficient way of
mm.
generating energy, specifically for the healthy cells, right? Cancer cells
Mm.
cannot ferment it, because
Yeah.
your fatty acids can only be used to produce energy when there's an
Mm.
oxidative phosphorylation. And when you have cancer, your structure and function of the mitochondria is corrupted, so that it cannot use fatty acids. Right?
Mhm. Now, my next question to you is, how important is rapid NAD plus regeneration via lactate dehydrogenase? And does that explain the preference for fermentation even when oxygen is present?
I can't comment on that right now.
Okay, okay. Now, okay, now since we,
But
dive.
to clarify that, see, um, NAD is actually an uh, electron shuttler. So it carries NAD,
Mm,
converts into NADH, which carries electrons to different complex of electron transport chain, right? And again, it carries to complex and it goes back, and again NADH goes again
mm,
becomes NAD and it carries, right? So essentially,
mm,
that's so. If your mitochondria is corrupted, the NAD and all those things does not make sense, because your mitochondria NAD is not going to transform energy into ATP. Right?
mm, mm. Okay. Okay. Now, my next question is that is the Warburg effect primarily an adaptation to hypoxia that persists, or I
Hyper,
mean, how does it relate in terms of the cancer
so
cells?
hypoxic situation is when you have maybe you don't have oxygen, right amount of oxygen for a specific time period. And again, hypoxia is something, intermittent hypoxia, which also caused by sleep apnea and sleep issues, could also be one of the reasons why your cancer cells become less efficient, because there's no oxygen available to transform ATP, and then they resort to the fermentation process.
Hmm, 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 hmm.
But that's
Okay.
that's that's one of the factor that could trigger cancer, but that's not the only reason for it.
Hmm. I get it now. Okay, my next question is related to the imaging part. Now we have the PET imaging, right? The PET scan that is very common, and it relies on the high glucose uptake of many tumors, right? Now, how has the Warburg effect shaped clinical practice, and what are the kind of limitations it has? Because as we all know, they do give you a glucose shot for the tumors to show up. Now, what
Hmm.
would be now, let's say if you want to really detect a tumor, what other approaches can come up in that sense?
See, PET scan is a standard practice used to, as you rightly mentioned, that it gives you glucose so that it's your cancer cells can show up and they can detect, right? That is
Mm,
one way to identify that you have tumors, because again, it goes back to basic premise that tumors ferment glucose and glutamine, right? So essentially,
mm,
when you're giving glucose, your cancer cells can come, and PET cancer can see where your tumor is, and then that's one of the tool for cancer hospitals and oncologists to prescribe chemotherapy and immunotherapies, right? But the problem here is actually that they have still not understand the biochemistry behind the disease, and what they do is, irrespective of chemotherapy or immunotherapy, they never tell patients to adopt better dietary choices. So in fact, they because of this because tumor cells resort on glucose and glutamine, so probably they also could eat up your muscles, right? What we call as cancer cachexia. So during
Mm,
cancer cachexia, they eat up the glutamine and the muscles to get their more energy, and that's how you start losing weight, right? So
mm.
doctors and most of the healthcare practitioners, what I have found is they'll say, eat glucose, eat a lot of, sugary food because
Sugar.
you're losing weight. They don't understand that you're feeding
So carbs
your
will also feed the same cells,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
The
yeah. So
simple carbs, not the complex.
anything, not complex carb also. Anything which has glucose is going to feed your cancer cells. And specifically, it all depends upon also upon the how those foods interact with your microbiome because your microbiome could lead to
Mm,
insulin spike or glucose spike as well. All right. So depending upon the inflammatory pathways they are activating, it could make high glucose in the bloodstream, which could feed cancer cells, right? So
mm,
essentially, that is one aspect of it, right? In
mm.
terms of PET scan is used to identify raw cancer cell, and then the objective was to give chemotherapy. But if you're not focusing on uh, starving cancer cells of the fermentable fuel, which is glucose and glutamine, your therapies are not going to be effective.
That's right. So, Shant, now since we've spoken about how the cancer cells ferment and how they, become lethal for a patient, right? Now, my curiosity lies that since you've been mentioning it time and again that glucose and glutamine are the feeders. They feed all those cells. So, I mean, is this thing really simplified? I mean, if we restrict the intake of glucose and glutamine, so the cancer, what will happen to the cancer cells, and what kind of therapeutic approach do you find to be working alongside the cancer cells?
Okay, so we have to understand a couple of things here, right? So essentially, uh, when we're talking of fermentation pathways and glucose and glutamine restriction, we're talking about late stage cancers, right?
Hmm.
Because early stage
Hmm.
cancers, even before tumor forms, can be fixed, right? There are a lot of research going on, and probably, we are also working on the same lines that,
Hmm.
it can be fixed by reinstating the ion channel signaling and gap junctions, right? So basically, you know that your mitochondria is getting dysfunction, so probably fix it with sort of a lot of nutrition therapeutic approach, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
reinstating the antioxidant pathways and suppressing toxins and regenerating the healthy cells, getting rid of, you know, uh, dead cells, triggering autophagy and metaphagy, and all those things are very essential for preventing the growth of cancer cells, right?
Hmm.
Also,
Hmm.
your NAD also comes into picture because your NAD is when there's inflammation, it eats up your NAD, right? So you have to make sure
Hmm.
that you are also getting rid of NAD from your diet and your pathways which transform NRMNM into NAD is functional synthesis, right? So coming back to your
Hmm.
question that that is a late stage cancer approach, and you you can restrict glucose by eliminating sugary food, high glucose food, a lot of food which are high in fructose,
Fructose,
right?
even fructose, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah. And then even so again these are then there are different strategies around it. So there are certain antioxidants in fruits which you may not be able to take if you have to take extracts of those food. Probably those things are there, but again you cannot restrict glutamine because glutamine is a semi-essential amino acid, or it isn't I'll say, yeah, semi-essential because it you can get from your food and your body also make it, right? And again, these are required for your gut function and a lot of other things. Right? So essentially, uh, what right approach is probably we should get into, ketosis, right? After consuming a lot
Ah.
of fatty acids because your cancer cells do not have, you know, machinery to ferment fatty acids. In fact, the fatty acids are stored in lipid droplets in the cytoplasm of the cells, so that if because this is just a productive measure for the cancer cells to product themselves, because ultimately if they resort to the fatty acid fermentation, they will die, right? It will burst, right? So essentially the fatty acids are being stored in the lipid droplet to protect those cancer cells, right? So again, it is very important to understand, here the role of mitochondria, and even in glucose and glutamine, because when mitochondria is corrupted, it sends signal to your nucleus of the cells via what we call as retrograde signaling, and this signal tells nucleus to express oncogenes that could bring enormous amount of glucose and glutamine inside the cell for the fermentation process to begin, right? So essentially here also mitochondria, even though it is dysfunctional in terms of transforming energy, it is still able to send signal to nucleus to actually to resort to the fermentation pathway. In fact, even the presence of oxygen, the mitochondria produces ROS, reactive oxygen species, rather than ATP. And this ROS is damaging to your protein, to your lipids, and to your DNA, right? What we call as DNA mutations, again, outcome of this thing, right? So essentially,
Okay.
so when you come to ketosis, when you are taking a lot of ketone, you're taking a lot of fatty acids, you are getting into fasting, because we know that during fasting, our body resort to the stored fat to generate ATP, right? Which is again it goes to stored fat release, and it goes to your liver, and liver chops into ketone body. And ketone bodies are used to fuel various healthy cells, right? For instance, specifically brain cells and heart cells, because heart cells generally rely on fatty acids to produce ATP, right? So essentially, you need a lot of these fatty acids to be to either by fasting or getting into ketosis, right? Therapeutic nutrition ketosis, which actually does not feed the cancer cells. So simultaneously, you are actually starving cancer cells of glucose. You are not feeding cancer cells, of glucose, and then you are feeding a lot of fatty acid, which is feeding healthy cells, and healthy cells can become dominant, and they can eat up these cancer when the cancer cells become, they are suppressed because of no fuel available, right? So that is one aspect, right? And again, one other aspect of ketosis is that it this is a vehicle to improve the therapeutic efficacy of the chemotherapies and other therapies, right? So it allows the delivery of the drugs to the tumor cells, and which is in lower quantity, right? So not that massive drugs, right? So you can take a small dose of these drugs along with ketosis, be which could make even chemotherapy effective, right? So this, and then coming on to glutamine, again, glutamine is, you cannot get rid of glutamine every time, so you have to do cycling of getting rid of glutamine, and then you can resort to certain drugs that could, you know, uh, suppress your or start your consumption of glutamine, right?
Hmm. That's a pretty interesting take, and I hope that in the near future, such therapeutics are actually implemented in the mainstream.
So,
Though
so
I know
I
it will
want
take a
I
lot of
want to
time.
repeat. I want to repeat here. These are all late stage cancer therapies approach where alone chemotherapy will not work. Specifically when your healthcare practitioner is not telling you to restrict glucose or to have a lot of fatty acids, right? Or
Hmm.
probably adopt a diet which would support the healthy cells while starving the cancer cells, right? In the early stage, obviously, if you could recognize even before the tumor form, if you can recognize the movement towards, you can fix the nutrition, and you can protect your mitochondria. Even, I want to
Absolutely.
say here that even the mutations or the viruses which are there, right, for which there's a lot of, I think a lot of these people have been discussing on vaccines or viruses, and people are debating on it, right, whether we should take or we should not take, right?
mRNA vaccines is what you are
Not
talking about.
mRNA vaccine
MR.
I'm talking of.
Okay.
I'm talking of the vaccines which may kill viruses, right?
Okay.
So I'm not talking of the COVID vaccines here, right? So again,
I'm pretty
you
sure
know,
that is going to be a phage therapy because only phages can eat up these.
mm, mm. so,
No, no,
so, so,
because viruses can't be killed. It has to be a phage
so
which
you,
can eat
I'm
up.
not saying viruses, we are killing viruses or not, right? So essentially, your viruses can damage your mitochondria directly or could produce metabolic byproducts that could damage your efficiency of the mitochondria to produce ATP using oxygen, right? So,
Mm,
so the only thing is these are secondary risk factors. So essentially, if your
mm,
mitochondria is healthy, you may counter that, right?
mm,
So talking of germline mutations, or the virus attack or the viruses like HPV virus and all those viruses. So essentially, if your
mm,
mitochondria is healthy, these are secondary risk factors. They may not cause the damage to mitochondria, right? That is
mm,
something which is important. So again, we have to remember a few things. DNA random gene mutations are the downstream effect of damage to the mitochondrial energetic processes,
the-
right? Right. It is not the cause, right? It is done because when your mitochondria uses oxygen to produce ROS, which damages the lipid protein DNA RNA, right? And that is how, or probably in other words, it produces a lot of dissipative heat that breaks these DNA molecules, right? That damage the DNA molecules, right? So again, those are essentially what happens, and then there's the DNA damage, the cells activate part again takes up a lot of NAD. So again, your answer to NAD is that you know uh, NAD is depleted because of a lot of inflammation going on, right? So essentially, and again, mitochondria is not functioning
mm,
because of the
mm.
damage to structure and function. So this is it's not work, right? So these are the few
That's
things we have
true.
to remember,
That,
right? So essentially,
that's entirely true.
glucose, anyways, we should not consume. And one of the precursor to cancer is obviously type 2 diabetes and insulin spike, because insulin spike make you store fat, right? And then that leads to high consumption of glucose, that leads to glucose spike. And in case of too much of glucose and too much of sugar, it damages the mitochondria, right? And again, or maybe the mitochondria has an adaptive response of, telling that I have a lot of glucose, I don't need more. So it actually, down regulates GLUT4, which is required for transporting glucose inside the cell. Again, that leads to high glucose in the bloodstream, right? So essentially, all these things are interconnected, right? So again, if you want to prevent cancer, prevent type 2 diabetes, prevent insulin spike, fix your microbiome, fix your gut and oral microbiome, because those are a key players in regulating your insulin levels, right? So this
That's
is something, focus on insulin maintenance, regulating insulin levels, not on glucose spike. Glucose spike is the second stage, right? So again, the focus should be on regulating the insulin levels, which is again, high insulin could be connected with the early risk for cancer, right?
I think this episode of ours is kind of a masterclass in understanding what kind of therapeutic approaches for cancers can come up, right? So, Sushant, now we have come to the conclusion of this episode today. Any specific messages you would like to give through this episode to our listeners and even the healthcare practitioners and the scientists who
See,
are working in the field of
I'll
cancer?
tell you a couple of things here very quickly. So every single cancer is connected with your oral health. So when you have
Hmm.
oral disease, when you have gum disease, when you have dry mouth, when you have acidic pH level, right? All these lead to production of inflammatory molecules that could travel to different body organs via saliva or via your bloodstream, and these could trigger energy resistance within the mitochondria of various cells, and it could make your mitochondria dysfunctional, right?
Hmm.
So, and second thing is that we all know that gum disease is directly connected with type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes is in precursor for cancer, right? So please fix your oral health. I will suggest go to dentist every 3 months, right? Adopt the right toothpaste, do not consume too much of sugar, do fasting at least once a week to start with, right? And have a lot of healthy fats, right? Do not fall for this high protein stuff, because high protein could be fermented by your gut microbiome and produce harmful metabolites that could further impact your mitochondria, right?
That's true.
So,
That's true.
right. So essentially, i- all these things, and nutrition is number one factor that could program your biology for health or disease, right? So focus on right nutrition practices, right? So these are the few things I want to mention here. right?
Thank you, Sushant, for such an insightful episode today. And folks, we will be back with another one next week. Stay tuned, and we are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts as well. Thank you.